Okay, good morning. We are on Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph, and we are learning about Sol HaYotzim Min HaSukkah. Sol HaYotzim Min HaSukkah is a special law that the Gemara is adding to the ways a sukkah could be made, even though there's some element of it that looks like it's problematic. It's Yotze Min HaSukkah. It's either schach, it's either going from the out of back of the back end of the sukkah, it's coming out of the front end of the sukkah, or it's an issue with the schach not being enough thick, it's not being enough giving enough shade, or it's schach puzzle. There's some schach puzzle there. There are different interpretations of the Gemara. But bottom line is that the Gemara is telling us, the Bryce is telling us that this Sol HaYotzim Min HaSukkah is going to be considered kosher. So what we got a little stuck on is how do you find each of these cases to be logically do they fit into the criteria of a kosher sukkah? Each of them is obviously giving us like an insight that, in other words, a thought that you might not be able to include this in the rules of a kosher sukkah. This should not really fit. And yet the Brisa tells us Sol HaYotzim Min HaSukkah is going to be judged like a sukkah. It's going to be kosher. So the first case was the case where, which was Ula's interpretation of this, which is that the schach goes over the back side of the sukkah. So it's Psal HaYotzim Min HaSukkah, and they're Yotzel HaChoyrei Sukkah. And what happened was basically he moved the back wall inward, and this way he was able to have a second sukkah back to back with the first one. And the question was, what do you mean? You need a hechsher sukkah. You need a certain size for a back to back sukkah. It can't just be. So of course there is that size. You need you need to have three walls. First the Gemara asks about the three walls. The Gemara says, yeah, you have the three walls. You have the hechsher sukkah, the 7 handbreadths. You have the thickness of the schach. It's a back-to-back sukkah. And so the way Rashi learned was that you might have thought that the middle wall was meant to be a wall for the first sukkah, not for the second sukkah. So you might have thought that can't be now a new wall for the back-to-back, so the sukkah on the back end, because it wasn't meant to be a wall for the back end. And on this, the Brisa tells us that it is considered a wall. And we, of course, got stuck on this because a wall is a wall. And this is it's a wall. It's a physical wall. This is not an imaginary wall. And so why shouldn't you be able to count it for the other sukkah? And so this was one of the problems that the commentaries all talk about. Why shouldn't it work? And we have a source. We have a Mishnah that says if you have a wall, the wall is considered well, even a wall of a house could be used for a sukkah. And even though the wall of a house is meant for the inside, you could use it for the outside. So this was Taisvis's question. Other Rishonim asked this question. And the Taisvis therefore learns a different pshat here. And he wants to learn that we're talking about the schach. We're talking about the schach that goes, and you would think that since the schach was meant for the inner sukkah, not for the outer sukkah, and should be puzzle, it's not made litzel, it's not made for shade, which is a little surprising what Tosfos means. Now, what does it mean it wasn't made for shade? If you're learning the case that Rashi learns, then that would seem that it was meant for shade. It was just meant for a different sukkah, but it was meant for shade. And the way Tosfos words it is, he says, well, it's not meant for shade. Well, what does that mean? It's not meant for shade. If it was put there on the big sukkah, and then you move the middle wall, then seemingly it was meant for shade. And so one of the ways of learning Tosfos seems to be that Tosfos is learning it's a little slightly different than the case that Rashi is learning. That not that it was a big sukkah in the beginning. No, it was actually a it wasn't like a big sukkah that you made smaller, and then you'll say it was for shade. It was then you'll say that well, it was always for shade. The schach was there for shade. No, it's that the schach was put on for the inner sukkah, and you didn't move the wall from the back to the front. Maybe the wall was always somewhere there in the middle, or and so, but the sukkah you wanted was the sukkah, the first sukkah. That's what it seems like. That's what Tosfos means. That because otherwise it wasn't. What does it mean? It wasn't placed there for shade. It was placed there for shade. And so you put the schach there for the inner sukkah, but the outer sukkah still got some schach on it, and it's and the schach that you placed was meant for shade. Each piece, there happens to be the pieces are double long, so they're sticking out in the back. So the conclusion of the Gemara seems to be that, according to Tosfos, is that even though you put the first half there is for shade, the back half is not for shade, but nevertheless, it's going to be a kosher sukkah. You get what I'm saying? According to Rashi, you moved the back wall. So initially, the schach was there always for shade. It was just meant for a different sukkah. It was meant for the inner sukkah. Now you move the back wall. Now you have the back sukkah. It's covering the back sukkah. So Rashi doesn't learn that the surprising thing is the schach. Rashi learns the surprising thing is that you could use that wall and give it make it considered a wall for the back sukkah as well. If the wall initially was not built for the back sukkah, how could it now serve as a wall for the back sukkah? The wall was really placed there for the front sukkah, and that's what according to Rashi, that's what the surprising thing is, that it actually could be considered a wall for the back sukkah as well. And of course that the question that we asked before, and Tosfos's question on that deserves answers. And we mentioned a number of answers how to answer Tosfos's question on Rashi, and that had to do with the fact that the wall of the sukkah is really a very temporary wall. The wall of the house, that we have a Mishnah that says you could use a wall of a house, that's a more permanent wall, or a wall of a house is meant for the porch outside. So a wall of a house is meant for inside and for outside. So therefore it could be used for the sukkah. We had also the concept that when you place the schach, you had in mind that you're using the wall for this purpose. And here, when you place the schach, initially you didn't have that in mind. Numerous answers that are given in order to answer Rashi how to differentiate between the case of psal hayotzim and sukkah according to Ula, which means the back part of the back-ended sukkah, versus the Mishnah, page 17a, that talked about having using the wall of a house if it's less than 4 handbreadths ledge from the house to the sukkah, that you could use the wall of the house and call it doifen akuma. You could use that wall, even though the wall is meant for the inside. So that would be ways of differentiating and answering Tosfos's question. But Tosfos wants to say that we're not talking about the wall, we're talking about the schach. And even though the schach was put there for the inner sukkah and not for the back of the sukkah, not for what's behind it, but nevertheless, the back sukkah, the outer sukkah in the back, will be kosher. And he says that the meaning of it is that the sukkah, you might have thought that the schach wasn't placed there for shade, Um, Nevertheless, it's going to be kosher because the schach was placed on the first half of the sukkah, and um, the back end of the sukkah there it gives off shade, so it'll be considered that is placed there for shade. We could consider it that way. I think the meaning is because do you divide a piece of schach in half? Now, the first half of the schach is placed for shade. So do you say, well, the other half that's sticking out is not placed for shade because it's sticking out? I mean, it's one piece of schach. So it happens to be long. It's sticking out. You put it down for shade. Do we look at it? Can we consider it that it's for shade? Is it two separate actions? It's one action. You put it down. You put down the schach. That's what it seems like. Again, the Taisus is a little vague. The Taisus doesn't like spell out the story. He just says, we're talking about the konim that are yoytze la'achrei sukkah, and he says some svarim even have this girsa in the Gemara, hani konim legavoy avidi, levroi loy avidi. So it should be puzzle because it's not for sale. Kamashmalan, it's kosher. That's the wording of Taisus. But that's what it seems like, that he's learning a different case, that it's not that you're moving the back wall, because he says it's Eina Asuya Letzel. It's not meant for shade. Sounds like this was placed there without having in mind, really, that it's going to be used for a sukkah. But nevertheless, the first half of the schach is for the sukkah, and this happens to be the end part, the back part of the bamboo sticks. It's the second half of the bamboo sticks. So they're sticking out. Were they placed for shade? Well, the first half is placed for shade. The half of each stick. There's one half of each stick that's placed for shade. So do we look at the back half that it's not placed for shade? It's a very interesting thing that we're going to consider it that it's meant for shade, even though you didn't have in mind to use that sukkah at all. So in other words, it's almost like the sukkah was made in the back, but you didn't have in mind to use it at all. And then you said, well, let me sukkah is kosher. Okay, yes, I could use it. If it was, and you might think that it wasn't even the schach wasn't placed there for shade. No, it is. So my thought is that what he means is, because if you take every piece of bamboo and the first half of the bamboo is placed for shade, you can't say that the back half is not placed for shade. We don't divide each piece of schach and say this little part is meant for shade and that part isn't. Anyway, that's my understanding of Tosfos. And that's the first. Anyway, so that gives us an understanding of the first insight of the Gemara Ula's interpretation, that it's psal hayotzi min sukkah is telling us this special law, either about the wall being kosher for the sukkah, or for the schach is kosher. Okay, then we have the next interpretation. That's Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef. I should mention that before we do Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef, I should mention one thing, and that is, what would Rashi say to Tosfos's case? Would Rashi argue maybe, and say, well, according to Tosfos, if you put schach on for the first half, does it really work for the second half? Like maybe that wouldn't be valid. Like could be Rashi might even argue on Tosfos. It's not my own insight. It's mentioned brought at the core. They asked this in the commentaries, like they question, would Rashi agree with Tosfos? On the one hand, Tosfos does have a logical svara that you put the schach there, so the part of the schach is not covering was not meant to cover the sukkah. It's still, you put it down for shade. I mean, you put the schach down. You're not thinking about what half of the schach is on your sukkah, what half isn't. You're putting it down for schach. I don't know if Rashi would, but they mentioned could be Rashi doesn't might not agree with that. I mean, it's a chiddush. It's that it works, but it's the question is how big of a chiddush is that? Is that surprising? Okay, in any event, we have Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef, and they have another interpretation that's talking about the front of the sukkah. In the front of the sukkah, you got the schach sticking out. Now here we had other problems with this case. I mean, the Gemara asks, well, the Gemara says that one of the walls travels along this schach that goes out the front door, front entrance, and one wall on the side continues along it. The other wall doesn't. And you might have said it doesn't have the hechsher sukkah because let's say that front area is, it doesn't have the measurement of full 7 handbreadths. It doesn't have the second wall going with it. It's only one wall going on its own, on its own, and maybe you would not be allowed to dwell in that outer area of the sukkah. So Rashi uses the word that the second wall, since it doesn't travel along with it, so it sounds like it's a separate area. And then Rashi adds, and it doesn't have 7 handbreadths of the hechsher sukkah, like a hechsher sukkah. An interesting addition that Rashi adds here. That seemingly the fact that it doesn't have the second wall is the problem. If you want to say it doesn't have the 7 handbreadths, you might want to ask, well, it doesn't have a third wall either. It doesn't have the middle wall. Now, if you're looking at this as a separate sukkah, so then what are you worried about? That it doesn't have the 7 handbreadths? What about a middle wall? What about a back wall? It doesn't seem to be bothered with that. It's an interesting. The issue is now the issue with this sukkah, at least the way the Rashi's interpreting it, is that you only have one wall going along. So the problem is that such a chiddush? What about a regular sukkah that the Gemara says is kosher, 2.5 walls? 2.5 walls means that one wall doesn't go along with it. So why are we so surprised about this this law that it's going to be kosher even though one of the walls doesn't go along with it? Of course, one of the walls doesn't go along with it. That we know is a kosher is the minimum kosher sukkah. You have 2.5 walls. So the Sfas Emes asked this question, and that was the he doesn't even answer it. The Sfas Emes is stuck with this question. Said what is the chiddush over here? Rabba and Rabbi Yosef. Sol hayotzim and sukkah is kosher. Of course, it's kosher. You have 2.5 walls is a kosher sukkah, and this is a kosher sukkah. So we mentioned yesterday that there's a rush that seems to be answering this question, because the rush says that you have one of the walls goes along the entire schach, and the other wall goes along but doesn't go all the way to the end, but it goes past 7 handbreadths. And I looked at the rush again after we mentioned it yesterday, and I think the looking at it again gave me a slightly different understanding of it, and that is that the one wall of the schach is going all the way to one wall is going all the way with the schach. The other wall is going more than 7 handbreadths. Now, but it's not going all the way to the front, but it's more than 7 handbreadths. So the thought is that if you made that wall more than 7 handbreadths, why did you do that? You could have gotten away with a tefach. You could have gotten away with 4 to the handbreadths. You could have gotten away with 7 handbreadths. What did you do? You made it 10 handbreadths. In the other wall, you made 20. Why did you do that? It must be that you had in mind that you're not using the outer area. When you made the second wall, you realize I'm not using that whole outer area. I'm only going to be using 10, and I want to have 3 full walls for my 10. And so I made 10 handbreadths long a wall. Why did I make it more than 7? Why did I make it more than 4? It must be because I want to have 2 walls around me. That's my sukkah. So because I'm showing that that's what I want, and I'm not having in mind to dwell in the outer area. So it's the question is, does that mean that I'm sort of not including the outer area in my sukkah, that I'm not expecting to use that area in my sukkah? Does that make it invalid for a sukkah? Because I'm not sort of like not having in mind to use that area for a sukkah. I'm putting the schach. The schach is long schach. It's going over that area. But am I having in mind really to use it? No. When I put the walls up, I clarified, but by making that second side wall, I'm making it clear my das. I'm revealing my intent that I'm only living in a 10 by 10 sukkah. I'm not living in it's a 10 handbreadth sukkah. 10, that's what I'm interested in. That's why I made the wall 10 handbreadths. Could have made it 7. I could have made it 4. I could have made it 1. I made it 10 because that's what I'm living in. So I'm not having in mind to dwell in the outer area.
Rabbi,
and so maybe it should be included. And so the Gemara concludes and says, Kamash Malon, that this is called Psala Yotzim and Asukah. It's kosher. You have one wall going along with it. It still falls into the category of 2.5 walls. Yes.
maybe that size is because that's the size of the board that the person had on hand.
Right. Right. Yeah, could be. It could be. The Rush uses the word, why did I do it that big? I was giloi daitoi, that his kavana is to have a 2-walled sukkah. He wants to sit with both walls, and so therefore the outer part should not be considered. It's like an entity of its own, and the schach only has one wall. And Raisa says, nevertheless, we don't care about his intent, because making the sukkah doesn't it doesn't play a role. The whole sukkah is considered one sukkah. So the point is that what you're saying,
the board, the kavana is that he looked in the back of the house, and this is the size of the board that he had in the back of his house. So that's why he did it that size.
No, I hear you. So let me answer. So the thing is, your scenario, according to the Rush, would not be so surprising that it's kosher. But what would happen if he actually had that in mind? That he specifically wants a 10 handbreadth. He says, what do I need? I need 10 handbreadths. That's what I need. Not 7, not 4, not 1. I want to have the sukkah. What happens if he actually had that in mind? Would you be allowed to dwell in the outer area? If he took that piece of wood, like you're saying, and it was just because it happened to be there, so he didn't have that in mind, and maybe he even explained it to people who are around that that's what his purpose is. In that case, maybe there's no question. On the other hand, it could be also that it's giloi daitoi, that in other words, he's revealing it looks too much that way. So maybe it would be like an issue of people that it's seen as that way, that's what his intent is. But it could be not. It could be that it has nothing to do with other people. It's himself. Did he have that in mind? If he had that in mind, can we use the outer area afterwards? Can he change his mind after and say, you know what, I want to use the outer area? So, in that scenario, the question would be, would it work? And the answer is yes. Now, in your case, maybe it's 100% fine. Maybe there's no question. In your case, maybe it's 100. He didn't have that in mind. But here, it could be he had it in mind, or it could be we look at it as if he had it in mind, because we assume if he's not sure what he had in mind, so we maybe assume that's what he had in mind. But the bottom line is that it works even if he had that in mind. It's considered it's a continuation of the sukkah. This is still the same sukkah. So that's the way the Rush seems to answer this problem that the Sfas Emes is bothered with. Now, the Sfas Emes came much after the Rush, but the Sfas Emes leaves it as a question. But it seems that in the Rush, it's that you could explain it that way. But that's again the problem that we have with this understanding, this opinion of Rabbi Yosef, is what they're telling us is not so new. We know it from the law of a 2.5 sukkah, that a sukkah could be 2.5 walls. You basically have the same teaching. Once you know a sukkah could be 2.5 walls, you know that a sukkah doesn't have to have both walls going along the entire area of the sukkah. So then comes the next opinion, and that's really where we got up to. We're up to Rabba bar bar Chana. So Rabba bar bar Chana is maybe about 13 lines from the bottom of the page. The Gemara here continues with another meaning of what Psal HaYotzim and Sukkah is. Again, we're on page 19a, about 13 lines up from the bottom. Rabba bar bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo nitzracha, it's not needed to tell us that Psal HaYotzim and Sukkah is kosher. Elul Sukkah Sherubah Tzilsa Merubah Mechamsa, that it's coming to tell us that a Sukkah, that majority is shade, more shade than sunlight. But a minority of it is chamsa meruba mitzilasa, is more sunlight than shade. I might have thought to say that it should be invalid because there's a small amount that is not enough schach. You have some areas of the sukkah that don't have enough schach, and so you would think, at least the way the simple understanding of this is, that you would think that you would not be allowed to dwell in that specific area. But another way of learning it is you might think that the entire sukkah is invalid. So in other words, part of it is too much sunlight. So the problem is, so the Gemara is saying you might think that it's not good. What's not good? Either not good to dwell under that area, or is it not kosher, the whole sukkah? We have a thought that maybe that would invalidate the entire sukkah, because the whole sukkah needs to have, in all areas, maybe it should have majority shade. So the Gemara answers, Kamash Malan, it comes and lets us hear that Psal HaYotzim in sukkah, that this schach that's leaving from the sukkah, which the Gemara asks, what does mean leaving? We're going to now see. But this psal, that's this area of stach that's not thick enough, it's going to be nidain kasukah. It's going to be judged like a sukkah, and therefore it's kosher. Now the Gemara says, "Umay yotze." So what does it mean that it's leaving the sukkah? So the Gemara asks this question only here. The previous two cases, the Gemara doesn't ask this question. Why doesn't the Gemara ask this question? Because Yotze in the first case meant it is physically, the schach is going out from the back of the sukkah. But Yotze from the second interpretation, Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef, it means the schach is going out from the front of the sukkah. And what is the third translation of Yotze min sukkah? There's schach on the sukkah that's not thick. So did it go out of the sukkah? What does it mean? It's Yotze min sukkah. So here the Gemara asked the question, what does Yotze mean? It's on the sukkah. It's part of the sukkah. It's going out of the sukkah. So now the Gemara says, no, the meaning of this, you have to understand it not exactly so literally. It's yoytze, it's going out of mehechsher sukkah. It's not fulfilling the rules of a sukkah that the area around it is a kosher area with schach, and this is leaving that area from the thick schach, and it's going out of the kosher, the hechsher sukkah, that and it's going out of it to be an area that's not well covered. It's not thick. It's not thickly covered. So it's going out from the rules of hechsher sukkah, or from the area that's hechsher sukkah. You could probably translate it both ways. It's yoytze. It's not mesuchach kehilchis sukkah, so it's going out, so it's psal, that's yoitze. So in other words, what it means is at least the way Rashi seems to be saying is that it's an area in the schach that's not in the area. It's not kosher. It's not properly schach. So it's yoitze. It goes out of the rules of schach. An area that's going out of the rules of schach. It's yoitze mehechsher sukkah. It's an area. It's a psal. It's kosher schach, but it's yoitze from hechsher sukkah. It's not thick enough. So it's going. It's falling out from the rules of the proper rules of schach, and yet it's still going to be kosher. It's going to be judged like a sukkah, and you would still be allowed to dwell under that area. Now comes the next case, and that's Reb Oishia, the next interpretation. Yes, Jeffrey.
So sometimes we use the word yotze to mean you fulfill the mitzvah.
Right.
So is he sort of like making a pun? So because he
here
did say 2 times, right?
Well, because it has the mem, it's instead of if it would say yotze hechsher sukkah, it would mean you fulfilled the hechsher sukkah.
Right,
Yotze may hechsher sukkah, the mem sort of like kills that and says you're going out of the rule, the kosher sukkah, the rules of kosher sukkah. Yeah.
So I think he's making a little pun purposely to emphasize the fact that it's really not as acceptable, but we allow it. You can still sit. You still can sit over there.
So in other words, what you're going to tell me is that this is this is like a hint that this is b'diavad. It's not l'chatchila. And where do you get that hint? Because he's using the word yoitze, because according to him, that's why it uses this strange language. And it could have just said psal hayoitze ben asukah, could have spelled it out. That psal, that's an area in your schach that's not thickened. It's kosher, because it says that's an interesting deal. I appreciate it. I think it's interesting that you're mentioning that. I don't know if I'm not convinced, but it's an interesting. Okay. I'm gonna think about it. Sounds like an interesting deal. It deserves a little more thought.
When I'm looking at it, it struck me.
In other words, you're bothered with why would it word it so strangely, and you want to say that maybe it means that it's only b'diavad. So what we need to see is if Shulchan Aruch says that as well. Like, is that considered a b'diavad sukkah? If you have some areas that don't have thick enough schach, is that like b'diavad, or is that? I mean, we look. What do we look at? We look at the whole sukkah. The sukkah has enough schach. It's fine. It's kosher. Or do we say that so you want to see a diuk here that maybe it means that it's yoitze? See, the problem is that I don't see the hint. So leading into, I agree with your question. It's surprising he uses that strange language, but I don't see the fact that he uses the word yoitze to say that you're only yoitze. To me, that's like stretching it a little. I think it's a good question. So I like the fact that you're bothered with the fact that it's not.
They could have found another word.
They could have used another word, right?
They could have found another word to say it extended beyond the sukkah. They have plenty of words. So they were very.
I agree with you. It's a good question. I like the question. The answer that you want to prove from it, I don't see it being convincing enough that yoitze is from the other word yoitze. You know what I mean? It's sort of like it's too stretched. If it would like fit right in, I would like it. It would really be nice. It's yoitze. I don't know. Yoitze mehechsher sukkah. But
what was the wording of the price? Was like Tana Psal Hayotze min sukkah. So he doesn't use that same phrase.
You know what I mean? Like if it would have hinted something in the conclusion of that sentence, like nidoin kasukah, if it would have said it's yoitze kasukah or something, yoitze, fine. Then I would like say, oh, you got a little hint over there. It's like, oh, you yoitze, like you just fulfilled it, but it's not like l'chatchila. You know what I mean? If it maybe would have worded it a little differently. I think you would have a better deal.
Right.
Here,
I
you're
mean,
asking that it's worded strangely, which is true. It's definitely not the simple meaning. You would think you would have used better wording, but the conclusion, therefore, let's say this. I don't see it as a definite. But I like the question. The question is a good question. Why did the Brisa? Why did they say that? Sol hayotzi min hasukah. Why did they call it that? Okay, now let's. So anyway, so this seems to be somewhat of a chiddush. What's the chiddush here? Rabba bar Bachon and Renim What's the innovation of this law? So according to this opinion, Rabba bar Bachana, the innovation over here is that schach. Do we look at every area of the sukkah, or do we look at the sukkah as a whole? That's what it seems like. And the Gemara's conclusion is we look at the whole sukkah as a whole. We don't look at each individual. It's as a whole. As if the entire sukkah has majority shade, then it's kosher. We don't look at the sukkah, each individual area of the sukkah. Is that considered kosher or not? Now there is an interesting question here, and it's brought in the Ran. The Ran brings an interesting question. He says, what happens if you have a sukkah that is 7 handbreadths? If you have inside your big sukkah, you have an area that's 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths of very weak schach. Does that, then, can you say that, well, this now, it's a whole different story? Until if you have small blotches of in areas that are small little areas that don't have thick schach, okay, fine, it's one big sukkah. What about if you have a whole sukkah inside your sukkah? You have a 7 by 7. So he says, then can you still say this law, or do we then say, well, this area we got to cut off and say this is not part of your sukkah? It's going to ruin your sukkah, or at least it itself is ruined. It can't be acceptable for to be considered a kosher area. So that he leaves with a question. So that could be problematic, and that the question is: if we follow this in Shulchan Aruch? And I believe this Ran is brought in Shulchan Aruch, which means that a person should be careful that even though their sukkah in general is majority shade, but any area that's 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths, which basically means 21 inches by 21 inches, that's not properly shaded. You should make sure that it's that you should add some schach before sukkahs and properly make sure it's properly shaded. And this way you don't have this problem of the Ran. The problem of the Ran could create bigger problems, because if the Ran is correct in his thought that it creates a problem, so what could happen is, let's say you have an area inside your big sukkah that's that's near the wall, that's or not near the wall, that starts at the wall and goes, let's say, to the front. So what would happen is this could break your sukkah. This would break your sukkah in half. And it would, even though you have schach there, but because it's majority sunlight, so even though you have schach, and you could say, well, it has schach, it's not invalid schach, it's kosher schach, but at the same time, it's majority sunlight. Now what happened is you have a psul along the middle of your sukkah. Now you got 2 separate sukkahs, and only there's 2 walls to that sukkah and 2 walls to that sukkah, and you don't have the minimum rules of a sukkah of 2.5 walls. You only have 2 walls to each of your sukkahs. So this theoretically could create a problem. I don't know if it's so common nowadays to have this type of problem. It used to be a much bigger problem when people used the branches. And people now use these mats. I think the mats are pretty much cover the majority. They do make the majority sunlight, at least the common kosher mats, at least from what I've seen. It's they do a pretty decent job. So I don't know that there's any area that's missing that doesn't have um, uh, proper shade. But in the olden days, when especially because as Sukkot gets the days pass, so the schach does shrink, and that could create a problem where your whole sukkah is questionable if it's majority shade, and definitely some areas of it could be questionable if they're majority shade. And if you think about it, this Ron is not so far fetched because 21 inches by 21 inches is not a large area. That's a very small area. So if you have 21 inches, a little over 21 inches, 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths, he wants to say this could create a problem, at least sitting under that area of the sukkah. So that's, yeah, I guess to passel your whole sukkah, I don't know how common that's going to be. But to not sit under this area, because this area would be like a sukkah of its own, that would be invalid. That maybe that's why people look up every time they say the bracha leishiv basukah to make sure at least they're sitting under an area that's a thick schach. Yes, Jeffrey.
I know from experience. I don't like mats. I never used mats, and they weren't making special mats 40 years ago.
Right.
You had to undo the thread or whatever. So we have bamboo poles, and we acquired more of them. But when the wind blows, they roll. And sometimes the whole sukkah rocks, and then in the corners, the walls shift. And so it could happen that you have a space, and so what I have to do is have to roll the poles back. Okay, it's not a big deal. But,
which is fine on Cholamayid, but on Yantiv.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. But there's plenty of other space that's because when it rolls, provides. Well, it's usually in a corner because the sukkah walls rock and the ground isn't exactly flat. So these things do happen. But yes, we used to try to have a few extra fronds or things from the garden sometimes, so we could throw them up very easily. Didn't have to go find them, and you have extra. And you put on, especially on the corners. That's where.
That's where it often gets empty.
Yeah. It's just
right.
practical.
Right.
Things.
Yeah, I remember the bamboo sticks. We used to use bamboo sticks.
And we store them.
They were quite popular.
Yeah, we store them. It's very convenient.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good point. Good point. So anyway, so that's the Ron's addition based on this Gemara. Again, this is how it spells itself out in halacha. So you have that chumrah of the possibility that if it's a size of a substantial size, it could be a problem. It's interesting that the Gemara uses the term mahu de tema tipasel bahach porta. You might have thought to say that it should be invalid with this little amount. Why does the Gemara use that term, that it's going to be invalid with this small amount that's majority sunlight and minority shade, the small amount that you might think that it'll be puzzled with this in this small area, this small amount. It sounds like the Gemara might be saying that it only applies if it's a very small amount. If it gets too big, then like, almost like the Ran. I see the Gemara to be a little hint maybe to the Ran, because it says that you might have said or thought to say that it should be invalid, but why does it add those words? Bahach porta. That little amount, that's Rashi says that amount of this small amount should be considered puzzle. Well, I guess it's not a proof because you could say what the Gemara means by that is, yeah, I guess this is the meaning that it should be puzzle only in that area. In that small area, it's puzzle, not the whole sukkah. Again, some shouldn't want to learn that it means the whole sukkah. So here, that maybe the Gemara is using the word tipasil b'hach porta, that small area should be invalid. But anyway, I still think there might be a little diuk there, a little hint that it's only when it only applies when it's a very small area. Once it reaches 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths, maybe you do have to be more careful. Again, it's a little, you see a little hint there to the Ran, but it's not a complete proof because you're right. You could say like the way Rashi's learning that it's only that area is considered invalid. Although then the Gemara could have used a different term. Tipasel, that area should be invalid, and uses hach porta. So anyway, maybe a slight little hint to the Ran's chumrah. Oh, the Ran is mesupik. He doesn't conclude. He says, I'm wondering, I'm skeptical if this works, if it's more than a 7 by 7. Okay, then we have the next Gemara, the next answer of what psal is. Reb Oishia Amar, Reb Oishia says, Loi nitzracha, it's not needed, ela l'schach posel, pachos mishloisha, besukkah ketana, that the Brisa is coming to tell us, psal hayoytzi min sukkah, is that when you have invalid schach, and the sukkah is a small sukkah, so psal hayoytzi min sukkah is still added, it still completes the measurement that you need for the sukkah. Now, according to Reb Oishia, what does it mean, psal? Psal hayotze. So psal we were translating as the refuse of the vineyard, and that's considered psal, which is called pselas dagan. According to Rabbi Oishia, it seems like he's saying psal means the psul, like almost like invalid, like things that are puzzle. Yotzim and sukkah is still judged like a sukkah can help you for the measurement. And it's a little vague why he uses the word, why the Brisa uses the word psal, unless it means literally that it's puzzle. The psal, the psul, the puzzle schach. Just a thought that the Gemara doesn't seem to explain why he used the word psal, but the Gemara understands it to mean schach puzzle. That the psal means the schach puzzle, which is less than 3 handbreadths, pachas mishleisha, but it's less than 3 handbreadths, and it's a small sukkah. So the problem is, we know that you need to have 7 by 7. That's the minimum measure of a sukkah. And here, what do you have? You have, let's say, 5 handbreadths of kosher schach, and 2 of the handbreadths are non-kosher schach. So you're using the non-kosher schach to permit your sukkah and make it a kosher measurement. Does that work? So the Gemara says that's what the Brisa is teaching us. This is Rabbi Yishia's understanding. That you know what? You could use the non-kosher schach if it's a small amount, less than 3 handbreadths. You could use that to kosher your sukkah, and it joins the measurement that you have to make your sukkah kosher. And my yoytze, what does it mean? Yoytze min sukkah, because we're not talking about, again, it's not going out the front end of the sukkah, it's not going out the back end of the sukkah. This is in the sukkah itself. So what does it mean, yoytze? Psal hayoytze min sukkah is nidoin kesukkah. So what does it mean now? So the psal that's yoytze from the sukkah, so my yoytze, so what does it mean, yoytze? So it's yoytze means mitoira sukkah. It goes out of the rules of sukkah. So it's not just the hechsher sukkah, it's going out of the it's not even kosher for schach. And so it's considered psal hayotzei min sukkah, the psul that's not allowed and it's invalid. First, it's yotzei min sukkah, psal yotzei min sukkah, but it's still nidan kasukkah. It's still judged like a sukkah, and it is used for the measurement to make up your kosher sukkah in the proper to make it properly kosher, to make it the right size, to add to the size and make it proper size. So you're able to use the non-kosher schach to make your sukkah big enough. The Gemara asks a question. Rav Hoshaya asks a question. Lo yehei el avir. What do you mean? You need this is such a big insight. You're adding such a this is so innovative. This is so such a big. What are you telling me that you could use non-kosher schach to add the size? What about if it's empty space? Even if it was empty space, lo yehei el avir ba'avir. If you have a sukkah ketana, you have a small sukkah, and you have empty space up to 3 tvachim, less than 3 handbreadths. So aren't you going to say there that it's kosher for your sukkah? So Amalei Reb Abba. Reb Abba says no, it's not a good comparison, because your taka could use empty space. Amalei Reb Abba zemet starif v'yashenim tachta. This invalid schach, guess what? Not only does it make up your measurement, you can even sleep under it. Under the non-kosher schach, you got a piece of metal on it. You got a piece of, skewers. You got non-kosher schach there, and you're going to dwell under it. You can sit under it, eat under it, sleep under it. Yeshenim tach. But zeh v'zeh mitzdaref, this open area, that doesn't have any schach, it's less than 3 handbreadths, that is starif. Yeah, you're right. It could actually it could join together for the measurement of a sukkah, but ve'ein yeshenim tachtav, you're not allowed to sleep under it. Or you're not allowed to sleep under it when it's empty space, and that we even though it's less than 3 handbreadths. So here we have a clear halacha that even if it's less than 3 handbreadths, you're not allowed to sleep or eat under that area. So what's the minimum measure? Because every sukkah does have empty space. It's impossible. If it didn't have any empty space, it wouldn't be a kosher sukkah, it would be a house. So the sukkah is meant to have a little empty space. So how could you tell me if it's less than 3 handbreadths, empty space, you can't sit or eat under it? How could you have so what? It's less than 3 handbreadths. I mean, what is the measurement? So the thing is, it measures. There's 2 measurements that are given. One is if it's the size of a person's head or majority of his body, or of course the size of 3 handbreadths. The size of 3 handbreadths is a major problem because that could basel the sukkah. And but if it's less than 3 handbreadths, then the size is a person's, or if it goes throughout the length of the sukkah from the front end to the back end, that could be problematic.
If what?
So either if the sukkah, if there's an empty space from the back wall all the way to the front entrance with nothing going the opposite direction, so that would be empty space in the middle of your sukkah, even though it's less than 3 handbreadths. Or the other thing would be if it's the size of a person's head or the size of his majority of his body, that also would be a problem. But less than that, we're not concerned about empty space. So anyway, let's finish up over here. So the Gemara says, "Umi kamidi disruf and starif." Do you ever have such a thing that something could join together to make the measurement, but v'hu kosher, and it itself is not going to be kosher to sit under, like the empty space? How do you have such a thing? You have a sukkah that's 7 by 7 handbreadths. You have, let's say, 2 of the handbreadths are empty space, and we're going to say it's kosher. Your sukkah is kosher, but guess what? Don't sit under the empty space. You're not allowed to sit under the empty space. But it's kosher. It's adding to the measurement, but it's not going to be kosher to sit under. But Rabbi Yitzchok Bar Yoshev says, yes, there is such cases. And now we turn to page 19b. Tit hanoruk yoichiach. You have the law of tit, mud, that is noruk, that is pourable mud. That can prove that gives us a case where you have something that's could be mitzdarif, could join to reach a certain measurement, but at the same time you can't go to such, you can't dunk in such a mikvah. It can be mitzdarif, joined to the minimum measure of a mikvah, that a mikvah that has titanaruk with it, that pourable mud, that means that it's liquidy, and it's not thick. It's very it's very liquidy, and so titanaruk. So if it's the pourable mud, that is mitzdarif, it'll join the measurement of a mikvah, 40 saw. Nevertheless, but a person who goes into a mikvah that's made of only pourable mud, like tefillah, he does not become tahar, he doesn't become purified if he goes into such a mikvah. So you see this concept where something sometimes works for the measurement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you would be allowed to use it for to fulfill the mitzvah. It helps the measurement of the general thing, the general picture, like the mikvah, but it's not usable for going and dunking it. There's a big question on this. This Rashi, Tosfos has a whole different way of understanding it, because he has it says it's not exactly a good comparison, but we will save that Mitzvah Hashem for tomorrow. And Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Oh yeah, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good week, everyone.